What do Led Zeppelin, Britney Spears, and satanic messages have in common? Well, stay tuned because you're going to find out. Here's the principle that I want to explore in this video. Whenever possible, our brains impose structure and meaning on the information it's trying to process. We receive information from various sources, and we automatically try to impose an interpretation on that information that is meaningful to us. Our brains don't like interpretive ambiguity. So if information is incomplete or ambiguous, our brains try to fill in the gaps and construct a meaningful model or representation of what's going on. The model we choose depends on how our brains are primed to associate ideas. That can be because of hardwired shortcuts or learning and experience, or recent exposure to ideas or images. When we see faces in clouds and tree bark, that's a visual example of this phenomenon, where the stimulus is a visual image of some kind, and our brains take this ambiguous stimulus and impose an interpretation on it that adds more content to the representation than is present in the image itself. And the result is that we see not just an arrangement of shapes and colors, but a face. In this video, I'm going to show you an audio example of this phenomenon. The example involves a process known as backmasking, or rather, the charge of backmasking. Backmasking is a studio recording technique in which a sound or a message is recorded backward onto a track that is normally meant to be played forward. So when you play it forward, you don't hear the message, but when you play it backward, you do. Now, strictly speaking, we're only supposed to use the term backmasking to describe the intentional recording of sounds or messages, but people sometimes use the term more loosely to describe any meaningful message they hear in audio played backwards. In the 1980s, there was a period of panic where conservative religious organizations in the United States claimed that many popular rock bands were intentionally backmasking satanic or subversive messages into their songs, and that impressionable teens could pick up these messages subliminally, unconsciously, when the songs were played forward, and that this subliminal brainwashing made them more susceptible to premarital sex, drinking, drugs, and other sinful vices. In California and Arkansas, legislation was passed to protect people from these influences, and many rock groups were caught up in legal battles having to argue that they weren't intentionally putting backwards messages into their records. It's an allegation that is hard to refute because there actually is a long history of recording artists using backmasking. But it's also easy to think you're hearing messages in music played backwards, even when none is actually there. Here's a famous example. I'm going to play you an audio clip from one of their most famous songs, Stairway to Heaven, with the lyrics showing. Then I'm going to play the audio clip backwards. Okay, here's the clip.
If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alone there. It's just a sprinkling for the May Queen. Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on.
All right, now let's listen to it played backwards. Okay, most people hearing this will say that they hear what could be the word Satan a couple of times, but beyond that, they don't hear anything meaningful in this track. Now, I want you to try to remember what this sounded like to your ears. Keep that in mind. Next, I'm going to give you a suggestion for some lyrics. I want you to listen to the clip again with this suggested interpretation in mind. Here are the lyrics. You can read along as I play the clip again. Okay, that's a rather shocking experience, isn't it? All of a sudden, what was just seconds ago a bunch of meaningless sounds to your ear, you now hear as meaningful speech. Led Zeppelin denied putting this message into their song, and they very likely didn't, because it's not hard to find hundreds of examples like this, where an audio clip that everyone agrees is completely ambiguous when played backwards, all of a sudden sounds like meaningful speech when someone suggests a possible interpretation of that ambiguous signal. The suggestion primes the interpretation, and our pattern-seeking brains do the work of imposing meaning on the information. And once that interpretation is in your head, you can't help but hear it. Here's another example of somewhat more recent vintage. It's going to be harder to imagine Britney Spears and her producers intentionally engineering subliminal messages in Baby One More Time. Here's the clip played forward. Now, here's the clip played backward. Nothing, right? That's meaningless noise, right? Okay, here's the suggested lyric. For those who may be listening to this, the lyric is, "Sleep with me, I'm not too young." Now it's clear as a bell, right? This, I swear, is a slam dunk. It's so perfect. And now your mind is trapped. You can't not hear these lyrics when you play this backwards. Here, I'll do it again. Okay, let's bring this back to pattern seeking. What we've been looking at here are examples of the pattern seeking activity that our brains are naturally disposed to do. Pattern seeking is a very general phenomenon which can occur at the level of immediate perception or at the highest levels of abstract thought and everywhere in between. The cases we've been looking at with seeing faces in images or messages in audio recordings are operating at the level of immediate perception. They're examples of a phenomenon that psychologists call pareidolia. It's the experience of perceiving meaningful patterns or structures in ambiguous sensory information, where the meaning is imposed by our brains onto sensory information that is itself meaningless, or at least doesn't actually contain the meaning that we're experiencing. With images, that's visual pareidolia. With the backwards lyrics, that's audio pareidolia. I'm using these examples to illustrate the general features of pattern seeking that I talked about earlier. The information available to us is incomplete, and our brains look for opportunities to impose a meaningful interpretation on it. They do this by positing an interpretation and filling the gaps in the information to create a richer, more fleshed out representation of the world in accordance with that interpretation. In the case of faces, our hard wiring for facial recognition does the interpreting for us. In the case of audio recordings, it's the suggested lyrics that provide the interpretation that our brains then use to construct a meaningful representation, which then becomes the content of our perceptual experience, what we're directly aware of when we're looking at something or listening to something. I know this is really just psychology 101, but let's admit that it's a counterintuitive view that a lot of us have a hard time internalizing. Our naive intuition is that we experience the world as it is in itself, that the rich content of our experience, the colors we see, the songs we hear, the objects we perceive, this is already present in the world outside of us, and we're passively perceiving what's objectively there to be perceived. Now, this naive view of our experience of the world is demonstrably false. We now understand that the world we experience is a product of the interaction between the world outside of us and the complex biological, psychological, and social agents that we are. This is now part of our modern scientific worldview. Philosophers can argue about what all of this means for our understanding of the world, but this fact about our experience of the world is undeniable. Now, when we go about our daily affairs, of course, it's perfectly natural to default to the naive view. We need to pay attention to the people and things in our environment as they're given to us. It wouldn't be helpful or practical to always be second-guessing what we're seeing, how much is objectively out there or how much is constructed, or questioning whether our experience is a reliable guide to reality. But the truth is that this is where most of our cognitive biases live and operate, in the interpreted world of experience that exists in the interaction of our brains, our bodies, other people, and the physical world. This is where science has to go to explain how cognitive biases arise and how they influence our thoughts and behavior. And this is where we have to learn to shift our attention if we're to become more aware of these influences and adopt strategies for dealing with them. This is not an easy thing to do. It's a very different way of looking at the world than what we're used to. It needs to be cultivated through learning and through reflection. Okay, enough of this. Next video, we're going to talk about German carpet bombing patterns. The video you just watched is part of a larger course on cognitive biases and critical thinking. You can find it on Udemy. Just click the link on the screen or in the video description to get a 50% discount on the sign up. Or you can find it and many other video courses over at the Critical Thinker Academy, where you can sign up for as low as $3 a month and get access to almost 20 hours of video training on a variety of topics related to logic, argumentation, and critical thinking.